How are y'all doing today? Good. It was such a treat to listen to you all get messy this morning. I can remember I was a school leader a while ago. I was like, oh, I remember those conversations. And as messy as it was, and as complicated as it was, and as complicated our work is in our country right now, I have to say it was just so great to be in that room. And because it was a welcome home. Like, my partner and I just got back from a whirlwind tour of Southeast Asia. Like, literally yesterday at 9:30, I was on an airplane in Bangkok, right? So to come back to this just feels good to be home. My body is tired, but my spirit's recharged, right? We had the opportunity to travel outside the United States, and that's definitely a privilege. We don't take it lightly. We heard different stories in different languages in Cambodia. We learned about the impact of the Khmer Rouge on a family and the critical interdependence of literacy and democracy. And then we went to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, we learned about something called the War of American Imperialism, which is not the way we talk about it in this country. And the War of American Imperialism was Vietnam's third armed resistance against colonialization. First the Japanese, then the French, and then an attempt by the Americans. So after eating our way through cities and taking excursions to temples and museums, I have to tell you there were small moments where the familiar was really welcomed, and television after long days became our vice. And we watched Carlito's Way like 8 times. And raise your hand if you've seen Carlito's Way. Basic story of about a man of color recently freed from prison, trying to live an honest life, only to be pulled back into his criminal ways. The theme here was clear. Once a criminal, always a criminal. Another story, The Equalizer, we watched that about 15 times. Raise your hand if you've seen The Equalizer. Denzel Washington tells a fantastic tale of one former American intelligence agent single-handedly and violently subduing a complex, multi-person Russian organization to save the virtue of an American woman, all in 2 hours. Another theme emerged here. Extreme violence and bloodshed is justified when fighting for honor. And these stories were on repeat. And exhausted, we watched them several times. First passively, and then when we were a bit more refreshed, critically. And I have to tell you, we're not film critics. We're just exhausted travelers trying to make sense of our experience. And I have to tell you also that our comfort was really facilitated by our home language, English. At the end of those long days, all we wanted to hear was English. And the themes of those movies were culturally familiar, even though the context and the setting were unique to each of the film. And in our fatigue, we could easily consume the stories, and we could even be entertained by them. We had a mental framework that helped us make sense of what we were both seeing and hearing. But we had to ask ourselves some important questions. Why were these the American stories that were exported? And what were these stories trying to communicate? And what language were they using to actually communicate these stories? And what were the major themes? And on our 23-hour flight back to the States, we asked ourselves the same question about our work. In our work as educators, what stories and themes are on repeat? And what language and languages are we using to tell them? And when those stories are harmful, how quickly do we recognize the harm and try to write a new story? As leaders in this room, we have creative authority. And in a lot of ways, we can call ourselves writers. We are the people who have the influence and the leverage to write different stories, and at our very best, give other people the pen to write their own. But despite that power and privilege, we still have some fictional themes that are in deep circulation. Fictions with dangerous themes on repeat, especially in our schools. One is the theme of the rugged individual, It's one that gets recycled again and again, and it says that individuals alone can succeed. And another theme that's on constant repeat in our schools is intelligence is fixed and cannot grow. And even though tons of research, hashtag Carol Dweck, has proven otherwise, we can still hear ourselves saying things like natural-born athlete and natural-born leader, or I am not a math person, or I am not creative. And we say those things to ourselves, and we say those things to each other. And there are other fictional themes, like the gender identity, or the race of a person, or their country of origin, can somehow make a person either subhuman or superhuman. And those themes are on constant cycle in our news. But this is not new. At the turn of the 20th century, the new modern school system, modeled here in Boston, had to find a way to respond during the peak of immigration. And leaders at that time used a xenophobic lens to enforce what they thought was the right course of action. George Martin Henry, author of The Evolution of the Massachusetts Public School System, published in 1894, tells us at the turn of the century, the school approached foreign immigration and responded very interesting to the dilemmas around attendance and oversight. He says, and I quote, "When a new cause, foreign immigration, brought again decadence," and it should be noted that decadence in this context means the decline, "the last of the great compulsory enactments on the modern school system were made. Thus, the 5 conspicuous steps in the evolution of the compulsory features of our system were made: compulsory teaching, compulsory schools, compulsory certification of teachers, compulsory superintendents, and compulsory attendance." These were all efforts of the state to hold the entire people, and I quote, "to a standard to which some people were unwilling to reach." Determining the role of education is a repeated theme in our work. Should schools just prepare students to develop their economic potential, or should schools prepare students to develop their human potential? And the tension in this theme invites lowered expectations for some students to be the center of their lived experience. But also, this is not a new theme. When the innovation of universal public schools collided with the impact of the emancipation of slaves in the Reconstruction era, this ideological conflict governed the relationship between Black leaders, Northern industrial philanthropists, and Southern plantation owners. Booker T. Washington, in a lot of ways, amplified and shared the viewpoint of the Northern industrial philanthropists and the Southern planters. They were of the opinion that schools should prepare the laboring class for honest work without acknowledging their political subordination of their class position. In other words, sometimes returning newly emancipated slaves to low-wage jobs instead of no-wage jobs. And Du Bois, on the other hand, argued that education should prepare Blacks to demand and restore their civil rights, as well as the liberties enjoyed by other Americans. In other words, education should be used to gain and exercise political power. And unfortunately, the school-to-prison pipeline, also not a new theme or new story. Songwriter and poet Gil Scott-Heron's social commentary on the handling of the Watergate crisis reminds us of the partiality and also asymmetry of the educational and justice systems when he writes, "We beg your pardon, America. We beg your pardon once again because we found out that 7 out of every 10 Black men in jail, and most of the men behind jail are Black, never went to the 9th grade, did not have $50, and hadn't had $100 for a month when they went to jail. So the poor and the ignorant go to jail, while the rich go to San Clemente." I argue that these stories and themes persist not because of a lack of knowledge. No, but it's what underpins our knowledge and frames our knowledge about each other. And it shapes the stories and themes that we understand, that we consume, and that we syndicate. It underpins our methods of syndication and the very language we use to write and tell the stories of our lived experience. It's not our knowledge that keeps our stories in the past and keeps these stories repeated. It's our beliefs. are very conceptual systems about each other that keeps us watching the same stories again and again. So the question today is, how can we see beliefs? Well, we can't, but we do have language. And our language gives us clues into what we believe and how we make sense of the world. So our first step into understanding and owning our beliefs and recognizing our beliefs is talking about the way we talk. So my own beliefs about leadership and governance became visible when I started my first year as a high school principal in Washington, D.C., and we all know where Washington, D.C. is, right? When a traumatized, at-risk, low SES, Black urban student died on my watch. And I was devastated. Even though the student checked every box that would threaten his life in America, I was supposed to save him. After all, I was leading a school, and I was charged with writing a new story. His name was Kyrie, and I met Kyrie when he was just 13 years old. He was just a child. He was tall and thin, but had a muscular personality. And at 13, this boy was still sucking his thumb. I was 35. I was a DC transplant on a mission. Schooling and education were the cornerstone of my family. Educational opportunities catapulted both of my parents out of the working class into the professional class in the 60s. Excellence was not a choice, it was expected. It was so expected that when I finished undergrad, my parents didn't say, "We're proud of you." They said, "That's what you're supposed to do." Kyrie and I met at an open house. And this was a special open house in Washington, D.C., because 8th graders all across the city get to shop for high school. So my mission was clear: recruit as many students as possible. So akin to a missionary selling salvation, I told wondrous tales of deliverance in our state-of-the-art facility. My evangelism was transparent, conditional college readiness with a laptop for good measure. But sitting back, Kyrie saw something else, and skeptical of my conversion tactics, he laughed right in my face. My promises of salvation through an AP curriculum fell on deaf ears. He began talking to his friends in the middle of my sermon. And then he raised his hand, and excited to see the re-engagement, I invited his question only to be met with, "When is the pizza coming?" My frustration and annoyance were present, but not evident. You see, I was looking for those who were already ready. Only the strong, the gritty, and the obedient should apply. I was not looking for doubting Thomases. I was looking for those who were easily converted. By 2011, our high school was a technology-enabled one. Every student got a laptop upon enrollment, and we believed that students needed to be ready to engage and navigate a digital world. They needed to have the tools and the ability to manipulate the information in a digital context. And arming students with laptops was actually giving them a pen. We wanted them to write their own stories. But Michelle Molitor, visionary principal of a feeder elementary school, had been in the school system long enough to notice a different story on repeat, a persistent achievement gap. She knew that there was something deeper than just instructional techniques at play. She had a strong hunch that this achievement gap was not just about instructional technique and the knowledge that teachers had available to them about reading comprehension, fluency, or word choice. She knew it was much more than figuring out how to design lesson plans around size and quantity. She had a strong hunch that this achievement gap had a lot to do with beliefs and assumptions and worldviews that were actually shaping the school experience. So as a school, we invested in race and equity training. We started the school as a staff building on the principles of the knowledge about the impacts of systemic oppression and racism. We had a common language. We all shared our stories of pain and confusion and bewilderment and saw ourselves in our colleagues. We were connected through language and lived experience. And even though we were of different races and geographic backgrounds, at that school we were family, a chosen family. And as the principal, I thought we were ready. And on the first day of school in August, all of my school experiences unfolded and folded in one moment. As students played outside before the doors opened, I recall my own experience playing outside in elementary school near the Emancipation Oak. My first school experience was on the campus of Hampton University. The Emancipation Oak is a sacred tree on that campus. It is under that very tree that revolutionary teacher, Mary Peak, began teaching the free children of contraband. You see, during the Civil War, if slaves were able to flee to Union territory, they were considered contraband on Union soil, and this meant that they were free. Teaching under this tree has deep, deep significance in the state of Virginia and American history, because after Nat Turner's rebellion, literacy for blacks and also freed slaves was illegal in the entire state. Mary Peak's act of teaching reading underneath this Emancipation Oak was deeply symbolic, but also challenged the law and convention of the time. And it was also under this tree that Virginia's black community heard the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. When the new ninth graders got off the bus at school that I was the principal of, it took me back to my childhood, hopping off of the bus in middle school. You see, my middle school was an integrated school of choice in Hampton, Virginia. Because neighborhoods remained mostly segregated, in order to go to an integrated school, you actually had to access a school outside of your neighborhood, and families and parents had to bear that cost. This meant many poorer families, mostly families of color, could not have access to the most successful and the best schools in the city. And when students walked into the building on that first day, my college experience was brought forefront to mind. I was a strong student in high school and graduated at the top of my class. Actually, I love school. I'm sure that shows a bit. But all I could think about, right, walking on that first day was the academic shock I experienced during college and how that shock momentarily eroded my confidence and my sense of belonging. And all I could think about as I was leading that high school was how to make sure that students, especially students of color, never experience that feeling. So my friend Kyrie was late on the first day. And the first thing he asked for was his laptop. And then he went to class with an excited exuberance. But his first few days of high school was curricular pinball. The bright artistic back glass was painted with content-specific posters, aspirational language about our mission and vision, and college pennants. And teachers animated this art with their passionate lesson plans and expert stances. And each day, Kyrie was plunged into a new game. 6 different players took turns calling the shots for him and moving him and other kids around. The goal was clear: hit the target and avoid dropping the ball. And he bounced around the school, scoring points at some turns, but losing at others. Sometimes we scored victories. With many kids, we scored victories. But with Kyrie, we kept dropping the ball. And each day, game over flashed again and again. He was sent out of class again and again. And the playing field was tilted, just not in his favor. The game of losing and losing again became normalized in his experience. I just can't imagine what his life was like, having to constantly ask, do I really belong here? In spite of this, he showed up every single day with a smile on his face, ready to play. A black boy died on my watch. And when soccer season started, he started winning. And interestingly enough, it was in a space where he did not share language or racial affinity with any other students. The black boy who was losing in the classroom game emerged as a mature, skilled, disciplined, and discerning player on the soccer field. He practiced and developed his skills after school. His coach said that his skills were remarkable for a student with only after-school instruction. Kyrie continued to develop as a player with this skill, and with his team, he developed cooperation and trust, and that linked them like brothers. The interdependence that they shared was forged through practice, hard work, time, and a shared goal. But unfortunately, this pattern of winning and losing and belonging and othering became a ritual in his experience. So routine, in fact, I'm sure you all can guess it, he had a seat in my office. And we began to spend a lot of time together. And at this time, I learned more about his experiences. And as I did, my frustration with him started to transfer to the curriculum and the structures that excluded him. The time we spent together changed the way I saw him. But this time that we spent together meant that my own to-do list was growing. And essentially, he was getting in the way of my agenda. But I was soon to learn that he was to become my agenda. I decided he needed a behavior plan. I drafted the plan and created the conditions for him to remain in the school and pave a way for success. He chose the incentive. The plan asked him to navigate his classes, use his tools to ask for help to minimize his disruptions. And if he was able to do this, we would go shopping at his favorite store. This worked because he liked to look nice. Basically, if he won my way and if he did school my way, he would be deserving of a prize. I went to his home to share the plan with his aunt, and during the visit, I began to see him a bit clearer. This visit gave me context to better understand his behaviors. The home was dark. Several younger men were sitting on a couch deep in conversation. His aunt explained to me that in spite of Kyrie's mother still living in the neighborhood, and still you saw her on a regular basis, he didn't live with her. The plague of addiction kept her estranged son from her, and also kept two sisters apart. The pain in her voice as she recounted the story was louder than the hushed tone she used to retell it. She was relieved to learn of a plan to support her nephew and keep him in school doing right. After 3 weeks on the plan, Kyrie hit the goal, and we went to H&M. And he chose a pair of he chose a pair of jeans and a coat. That's it, a pair of jeans and a coat. And the next day at school, he walked a bit taller in that coat. He never wanted to take it off. And then he started winning at the school game. His behaviors improved. He started participating in class more, and he completed his work. His disruptions were minimized. And as the school approached portfolio presentations, the entire staff was excited for his presentation. He had work to present, and as a principal, I was proud. Kyrie and I agreed to meet at the school on presentation day at 7:30 a.m. to practice, to rehearse and put the final touches on his presentation. And he said, "I'll be there at 7:30, I promise." So when he didn't show, I knew something was terribly wrong. But on that morning, we began the exciting day of reflection, and panels of teachers and students and community members were all in place, listening to students talk about their work and growth. Then around 11 a.m., the first alerts buzzed our phones, followed by a second series of buzzes, and then a third series of beeps. And then a sudden barrage of tweets came through. Facebook posts and retweets composed this eerie cacophonic dirge. A community gripped by grief broke into wails when the Washington Post confirmed our suspicions with the following headlines: 2 DC cousins killed in a fiery crash. Game over. No lives left. No retries. According to the sources, Kyrie and his cousin and 2 other teens took a joyride in a stolen vehicle. It is unknown whether the boys knew it was stolen, but what we do know is that an officer saw something suspicious and ran the plates. And once the boys realized that they were being followed, a high-speed chase ensued, resulting in a collision with a tree. The police were able to rescue only 2 boys. The other 2 perished in the flames. A child died on my watch. But that's not the way the public saw him. The impact of his death had been barely felt before people claimed that the aunt, the very aunt who was supporting her nephew, was, quote, worthless, end quote. The direct quote from the newspaper was, "Worthless parents and worthless kids blaming racism for everything." Fellow citizens said that he was a member of a depraved subculture that just doesn't respect the law. And we need to talk about the way we talk, because the talk about subculture implies that there's a culture that is on top and that there's a culture that is on the bottom. And the use of the word depraved as an adjective assigns moral corruption and wickedness to the culture at the bottom, while suggesting that the culture at the top is both righteous and dominant. And in this language, the world views belief in the hierarchy where black and poor at the bottom are revealed. Kyrie's death was an indictment of his aunt's parenting and his mother's addiction and his cultural background and his blackness and his poverty. And in the court of public opinion, his death was an indictment of everything but the very systems that killed him. The role of education for the powerless is mute when you don't live to see your graduation. When we are used to talking like this, our beliefs tell us that we're not obligated to be outraged that a 13-year-old child died on our watch, and that 13-year-old children continue to die on our watch. A child died on our watch, and I was complicit. No, I'm not a law enforcement officer ascribing suspicion and criminality to black people, including black children, but I felt that there was blood on my hands too, because I had the power to change Kyrie's lived experience at school. I had the power to make sure that he was winning every single day. I had the power to change the game for him. And it was in Kyrie's transition that I began my transformation, because his death was a heavy weight for me to carry. He was a victim of poor police practice, a cruel body politic, an unresponsive, uncaring, and unfeeling school system. And this is a story that is unfortunately in syndication. I designed a school that did not respond to Kyrie and how he learned best. I designed a school that reflected how I learned best. I designed a school that reflected how I defined success and ways of winning. And this way of working and leading was endorsed by very powerful adults, while at the same time resisted and sometimes downright rejected by powerless students. And it was wrong. This realization was the first posture of my transformation. It took me another year to master the second posture, taking action and actually doing something about it. Washington, D.C. is a very, very special place. And it's a special place that enjoys the privilege and power and proximity to both politics and philanthropy. And in the same moment of Kyrie's death, D.C. was experiencing a resurrection as an education talent hub. This was in 2011, 2012. And this moment was catalyzed by several institutions, including City Bridge Education. City Bridge was one of the first organizations to create a teacher fellowship focused exclusively on education innovation. Teachers were offered time and space and resources to share knowledge and design solutions to classroom problems. It was not long before the notion of classroom design extended to whole school design through the Breakthrough Schools competition. Entrepreneurial school leaders like yourselves applied for funds and access to a network to operationalize big and bold visions that would solve problems that we saw in schools. Now, it was 2011, so we used words like blended instruction and self-paced and student-centered learning and mastery-based instruction to solve problems that we defined emphatically as due to a lack of student agency and persistent low expectations and little to no ownership. And I was excited to be a part of this community. But if I'm honest, Kyrie's lack of ownership and agency were not responsible for his death. and his choice to go on a joyride with his cousins, as many teenagers in America do, it's not what killed him. It was actually our silence and our lack of ownership and our lack of agency. 2 years after the redesign work started in the high school, I transitioned out of the principalship. And in my moments of introspection, I realized that I was seeing the story, but the themes were still really fuzzy. I knew that I needed to find a way to incorporate the voices of the most marginalized, like Kyrie, both in identifying the problem and the solution, but I didn't know how. I knew that race and equity were as important as design work and innovation, but I didn't quite know how they intersected. And I knew that the school was an institution that was situated within a broader community, but I did not know how to thoughtfully engage regular citizens in solving problems that were faced in the school. I started the DC Equity Lab to figure out what lived at these critical intersections and what we could learn when we mined and discovered there. We hosted free book clubs for the community at the library to build a shared understanding of history and build bridges across difference. We also helped together identify problems that our schools were facing and also brainstorm solutions to solve them. We hosted hackathons and design challenges around college readiness and engaged students and citizens as participants. But what was truly a game changer, truly changed the game for me, was the work that we did with the Truancy Task Force in Washington, D.C., in the D.C. government. And that would answer many of my questions and pose so many more. So at the time, city officials were looking for innovative ways to solve truancy problems. And truancy was a big issue in Washington, D.C., and significant progress had been made. But for the most marginalized and excluded students, the numbers stagnated. Truancy, or chronic absenteeism, impacts every school system, but not every child. It's universal, yet has a relentless and laser-like focus on the poor, the disconnected, the disenfranchised, and the forgotten. In Washington, D.C., only the poorest children experience truancy, and this caught the attention of city officials. And this realization helped to define the issue of truancy not just as a crisis, but most importantly, as a social justice issue. And this shift in the way we talked about this problem was critical, because when we talked about truancy as an issue that was rooted in injustice, we had to ask if we had the right tools to solve it. When we talked about it as a justice issue, we had to ask if we had the right tools to solve it. And this question opened the door to a powerful watershed moment. We had to ask, what has to be true of design thinking and innovation frames to solve social justice issues, those rooted in systemic oppression? And this moment led to other moments. And then we had to ask questions about ourselves and our own expertise. Like, who are the real experts in the truancy experience? Students and parents who experience truancy, or policymakers and principals? What was the truancy experience, and who actually owns and holds that knowledge? And if the experts are students, how do we build relationships and bridges between them? And when the experiences of truancy are uncomfortable and painful, how do we get the powerful to share their pain? Rethinking expertise to elevate the experience of the powerless was the real design challenge and created opportunity for relevant innovation. The solution was the Equity by Design framework that blends the consciousness of equity work with design thinking. And it was in this moment that my own conceptual systems made a shift and my fluency in a new language accelerated. By using that framework, I realized that the problem with students like Kyrie had nothing to do with Kyrie at all. It was me all the time. It was my belief that I should do something for him, but not with him. It was my relentless focus on the outcome, so much so that I forgot the experience in the process. It was thinking that my degrees and my upbringing and my status and my accomplishments made me right. I was convinced that I was the expert. It was thinking and believing that he needed to be saved, when in fact, I was the one in need of salvation. I had been blind all along, not because I didn't wish to see, I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to face or challenge the truth of my own assumptions. But what's most important to note right here is that it was the cultural belief of independence, not being influenced by others, rather than interdependence. We rely on each other, we need each other, and that we're all extensions of each other was actually the goal. I didn't get that. This shift in thinking is critical because our culture prides itself on independence. And it's this belief and language that undergirds myths and themes like the bootstrap theory and the myth of the rugged individual. And our reductive approach extends to diagnosing complex problems in the student experience as discrete and separate phenomena. Phenomena separate from issues of injustice, equity, and access. We create isolated behavior plans to address outbursts that don't acknowledge the whole child. And these behavior plans often fail to address the deep-rooted and long-lasting generational impacts of poverty and oppression. We personalize and individualize learning and center learning on students without acknowledging the oppressive world that awaits them. Unfortunately, content mastery does not yet protect the powerless from sexism and racism and homophobia. I wish it did, but it doesn't quite yet. So we need to shift from this idea of an independence-based society to an interdependent society where we are all connected to each other. And it is in this shift that I believe that we hold the greatest promise of collective transformation for our society. Because when we start talking about interdependence, the oppression and the suffering that Kyrie faced is no longer just his, it's ours too. And we see ourselves in his own experience. We need to talk about the way we talk, because as long as we assign people descriptors like depraved and subculture and traumatized and low SES and at risk, and all of us do this all the time, as long as we continue to do this without acknowledging how these labels justify and rationalize segregation and distance ourselves further from each other, we risk our own salvation. We rob ourselves of the opportunity to write new stories and interrupt the old. As long as we are talking about independence and governing over and controlling over, and not interdependence, governing with and controlling with, things like racism remain the burden and the problem of people of color. And problems like sexism will remain the burden of women. And homophobia and transphobia will continue to be the burdens and only the burdens of the LGBTQ community. And Islamophobia will remain the burden and the problem of the Islamic community. And xenophobia will remain the burden and the problem of the immigrant community. And the problem of poverty will just be a burden of the poor. As long as we talk about independence, the most privileged in any of these stories can repeat the age-old themes and choose to ignore their complicity, reject their ownership and agency, and continue to tell stories in ways that bend to their/our comfort and convention. And in this bending, we might spend billions of dollars for only a few pennies worth of impact. It may be oversimplistic to think that all we have to do is change our language and then challenge our belief, but I think it's the first step in creating a world that all students deserve to inherit. And this is the moment to do so, because future Kyries and Kylies are relying on us to do it. Right now, we have a critical moment in our culture, as our current talk in our country and mainstream media includes words like equity and inclusion and diversity, and it's not going to last much longer. It's not. These words were once spoken in hushed tones in the margins, and now they're in the collective consciousness, and they're mainstreamed. But we have to work to keep them mainstream, and that depends on our courage to act in a different way. Because in this room, we are the ones with the power and the privilege. We have a moment to engage in our country's most truly innovative design challenge. Imagine schools and systems, if we can design them, and in those design challenges, they were tasked with flattening hierarchies without flattening people. What if we designed our schools and our school systems to flatten hierarchies without flattening people? What if we redesigned our relationships and our learning so that diversity is essential and not just cosmetic? What if we asked our schools to be spaces of healing and truth and reconciliation, imaginative enough to help us write a new story, robust enough to carry our collective stories, but delicate enough to hold our individual stories? This is very possible, but it requires us to move and transform words like diversity, inclusion, and equity from talk to action. Because if we don't move to action quickly, we risk our current investments in diversity and inclusion. Because this work will be inert unless it truly builds bridges between the powerful and the powerless. If we don't move to action quickly, we risk all of our investments, both financial and emotional, in equity. Equity work will be impotent until the powerful and the powerless lead together in a spirit of interdependence. If we don't move to action quickly, we risk our significant investments in school system design and redesign. The design work will be redundant so as long as our biases to action cooperate with conventional biases to the powerful and never challenge the constraints of the spaces between us. So what type of world will our children inherit tomorrow? Well, it really depends on us today. It depends on our courage to connect and understand each other. It depends on our willingness to be interdependent. It depends on our ability to create a new understanding and allow new beliefs about each other to replace the old. And with this replacement, we have the opportunity for newly inspired actions, different connections, and transformed experience and outcomes. We have the opportunity for a new and different social order. We have the chance to write a new American story. Now, I told you I just got off of a plane, but a few weeks ago, I went to a funeral of a family member, and this wasn't a sad funeral. When you go to a funeral of a family member and they pass away in their 90s, it's a celebration. So the funeral was of my step-grandfather. My grandmother passed years ago, and she was married to this man for 14 years. A long 14 years after the passing of my grandfather. And a few weeks ago, my sisters and I drove from Washington, D.C. to Emporia, Virginia, a very sleepy southern town about 1 hour between Richmond and North Carolina. And this is where interstates turn to two-lane highways. That's where Emporia is. And then the back roads. So the barren fields were full of stumps and stalks as we drove through because the cotton was just picked, and bits of white fluff resembling scant snowfalls were kind of blown about the brown field. The pines were tall and the air was warm and thick. And as we pulled up in front of the Black Baptist Church in our hybrid, all I could think about was the distance between this moment, these people, and my current life. They were my family, but they were so different. They were my family, but we had walked entirely different and vastly different paths. They were my family and we were kin, but they did not talk like me, walk like me, but they were still family. And my dad, who's always this font of wisdom, said, "This is your family. This is your history. This is your story, pay attention." As fathers often do, if you're still lucky to have yours around, right? So that was an illuminating moment for me because as I drove back, I realized that who we are and what we know is shaped by our identities and our stories and how we walk through the world. And it's our identities that shape what we choose to believe about each other, what we choose to believe about each other, and the strength of our relationships, what we choose to know, and how we come to that knowing. Now, my grandmother, who picked those same cotton fields as a child and adult, did not need to look at the weather report to know that a storm was coming. You all have grandparents that can do that? Did not need to look at the weather report. She just knew. It's almost as if she felt it in her bones, and she would actually say, I feel it in my bones, a storm is coming. Why is that important? Because in that church, at that funeral service, I actually did not need to get an ancestry report from Ancestry.com or to know the surnames of those people in the room to understand and know that they were family. I just knew it. So who we are is shaped by our identities, our stories, and how we walk through the world. And I can tell you firsthand, you heard some of mine today, it's full of tilt and bias. But who we could be lies in the opportunity to build bridges within our own experiences and bridges with others, especially those who are different. Who we could be lies in our ability to see ourselves, especially those who are most different from us, as family. Who we could be lies in our radical imagination, our courage, and our strength, especially in the face of weariness and fatigue, to write, to tell, and retell different stories. Our children, our schools, and our community, and right now our country depends on it. Thank you. Of course. Yes.
Do you think, maybe it's two questions, but would you consider going back into more direct school administration to jump in and jump on that frontline student engagement, or where do you see your path going?
My path?
Yeah.
Right now? So I think that there's something really powerful and special in the way we're designing schools, right? I think as someone that is helping entrepreneurs design schools and redesign schools, I think we jump too quickly to the solution without identifying what the problem is, right? So I think right now, given what I know, I want to help people get it right. I do think school leadership is probably back. I was like, I want to do this again. Because I think the principalship is probably the best job in the world. It's actually the best job. So I definitely see it. I definitely see it, but not right now.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the equity design framework?
Yeah. So what do you want to know?
I know about design thinking.
Yeah.
And using that as a problem-solving
Mm-hmm.
tool. So now I'm trying to say, all right, well, how did you use equity and design thinking to come up with this framework, and what does the framework look like?
Yeah. So we wrote a paper about it, and it's definitely on the website. It's called Equity by Design: A Process for Transformation, and basically it outlines like 3 core beliefs and 5 design principles that anybody should be using as they're creating something new. So the first belief is that historical context matters. The past is in the present. And it's currently being designed, and oftentimes what I found out is that we don't actually teach American history, because if we actually taught it, we wouldn't be seeing what we're seeing again. Like, my father's a 75-year-old black man, and when you have that kind of asset in your life, he says, you know what, Caroline, people who saw the 60s and saw the 50s remember. Like, we remember. Y'all don't remember. But he said sometimes when you see things, you can't unsee them. So you have to understand historical context. And then you have to believe in radical inclusion, because our country is based on separation, right? Like everything about our country is based on separation, whether it's the separation between men and women, or the rich and the poor, or black and white. So it's like understanding that in order to create a new context, you actually have to be thoughtful about bringing those together. So radical inclusion is the second belief. The third belief is that process is product, right? And it says that we actually have to pay as much to the way we're doing things as we do the outcome. And I think in education it's so very important, because we've been focused on the outcome, and it's kind of like by any means necessary, and we've hurt a lot of children getting to an outcome where we're not very thoughtful about the process. So it's like, one, holding those beliefs, and then there are 5 design principles that says, one, when you're designing anything, you first need to start with yourself and analyze and interrogate your own biases and your own identity. 2, I'm gonna say these out of order, make the invisible visible. When you make the invisible visible, like you have to have the courage to call out sexism when you see it, racism when you see it, because if we are only doing what we've been taught to do. So if we continue to follow the scripts, our world is not going to change. So we actually have the courage to in love, call each other back in, like, you know what? That wasn't good that you just said that. Oh my gosh, I didn't even know I said it. And it's not necessarily to point a finger, but to say, like, we're all learning new ways. Another design principle that's actually my favorite is actually speak the future. So in Speak the Future says, we've never lived in an equitable America, so we don't even know what it sounds like, looks like, or feels like. So we actually have to have a courageous imagination to talk about something in a very, very different way and find inspiration elsewhere. I should know the other 2, but because I'm nervous, I'm forgetting them. I'll remember, no, probably I think the most important one for our work is a principle called design at the margins, where it actually was illuminated through the truancy work, because we realized that if we're actually looking at the most truant students and solving the problems for the most excluded, the most marginalized, we've actually solved them for everybody. Because the students who were most excluded in Washington, D.C., not only were burdened by poverty, I mean, there was poverty on top of lack of transportation, on top of lack of health care, food deserts, mental health. I mean, like, the kids who weren't going to school had all of the issues on top of them, right? So it's like, let's start solving for that. And if we solve for that, then we can solve for everything else. So I think I'm missing one, because I always do, but it's on the, I can point you to the resource that has it all. You're welcome. Yes.
What level does your work focus on? So is it primarily at the school level, or is it also district, state kind of organizations outside of school systems?
Yeah, so I think where my sweet spot is probably at the school and district level. Talk to me in about 5 years, it might be at the state level. But I definitely think that there are practical applications at all levels. Yes, Jason.
Your newest venture is creating this fellowship that you said brings the powerful
Mm-hmm.
in touch with the powerless. One, can you tell us briefly why that's necessary, and how a leader would operate differently after going through an experience?
Yeah, so I think it's necessary, because I think it's human nature to always work in your self-interest. I think people just do that, right? And I think that when you're working in your own self-interest, but you're not paying attention to how, if your self-interest is creating suffering for others, then that's the problem. That's when, like, your humanity is at risk. That's when your salvation is at risk. I'm a deeply spiritual person, so I use those words like salvation very carefully, but I think that if you can be happy while that person's suffering, there's something fundamentally wrong. And I think we have normed that behavior in our country, that it's okay for this school system to have all of this where these folks are suffering. Like, that's not right. So I think it's important to bring those people together, because until those bodies are proximate and in the same room, you don't get the spiritual change. For example, Kyrie, like, it took him being in my office and me going to his house to say, whoa, I need to check myself, because what I'm doing is not helping this young man. And as long as he stayed a number, As long as he stayed in the 2% of kids who didn't come to school, like that's not enough to change me. That's enough to change some other things. But that's not enough to change the spirit of the leader who's trying to make moves. So I think that that's why it's important. I think you just get the best ideas that way. Like you don't, I think in the part where it says like, racism is not a black problem, it's a white problem, right? So if it's a white problem, then how do you get white people to realize it? Not hanging around with other white people. I mean, it's just not gonna work, right? And it's actually like, you have to have people together to say, you know what? When that happens, this is the way it makes me feel. I know it wasn't your intent, but that's the impact, right? Or, hey, when all your dollars go to this school and not to this school, that's why these kids aren't successful. It's not because they're not working hard enough. In fact, they're working 5 times as hard as your kids are. But I think it's understanding that to get lasting change in beliefs, I believe you have to have proximity of the body. You have to have people together. They have to work together. They have to be close together. Otherwise, it stays knowledge, right? And we've had enough knowledge. We just need another way of knowing now.
Well, thank you very, very, very